the Rotary E-Club of World Peace. Imagine that our planet someday will be in the name of world peace. I would like that. I'm Barbara Mueller, and this is Rudy, and we're just delighted you're all here. Our club is devoted to hearing speakers that bring us inspiration and experience, because when you think about our lives today, we need some experience-based decisions. And I'd like to bring on, right before we have the esteemed Dr. Donald Grady, I'd like to bring on Lisa Broderick. Each week we will have a little bit of an introduction by one of our members. Lisa had a vision when she was sitting on the beach, and she saw police cars being peace officers. And I just wanted to have her give us a little update. Without further ado, Lisa Broderick, will you bring us up to date about what's going on with Police 2, the number 2, Peace is a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization working to solve the crisis of policing in America today. Lisa?
Barbara, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. Chief Grady, it's wonderful to have you here. So Police to Peace is a national nonprofit, and I am a Rotarian. The nonprofit was started a couple of years ago. And so what we're working on really is how to operationalize a change in police culture using the notion of peace officer. Now, 3 years ago, this wasn't really too much of a topic. Today, it is much more so. But what this has come to include is that working with how officers think about themselves, how they process their jobs, and how they respond to situations. And I'm sure Chief Grady is probably shaking his head, because this is really what it's about when we get to police culture. And so today, as we're all aware, the country is in a very tenuous place, a difficult place, but that also means that there's an opportunity for change. And what we believe that change is in policing is that both sides of a discussion will accept the notion of peace officer in order to try to resolve the situation of police violence, police use of force, lethal policing, and how police relate to their communities. I'm going to show you just a few pictures for fun. Oops, I didn't share my screen. Rudy, can I share my screen?
You should be able to. Go ahead.
Okay, got it. So just looking at a few of these are departments, actually, photographs from departments, where we have been working with a number of departments to operationalize this idea of peace officer. What we really have realized is that a cultural shift in the policing paradigm from recruiting for the adventure of it to returning to our roots as peace officer is what may actually work in this country in order to help our police have a greater connection with their communities and really stop the crisis of lethal policing. And so we believe we're taking a social issue that's prone to inherent hostility, right? Everybody knows that, and mistrust, and transforming it into a collaborative effort using peace officers. This is our first initiative where we are putting peace officer on vehicles around the country. These are fleets of cars. And so far we're up to over 1,000 cars, vehicles of different kinds. These are police departments, sheriff's departments, constables, and marshals going around the country. And so here's really the thought, and that is, if we go back to our fundamentals, what is the real name for cops? Actually, it's peace officer. That is how they're referred to in the penal code and how the law usually refers to them. So our belief is that peace officer is the one unifying notion that all cops are tied together by, and that we can actualize this by combining it with an ethos, which goes along with peace officer. And that ethos is to prevent conflict. If there's a conflict, help resolve it, diffuse situations, and to aid the defenseless. And as we know from recent media accounts, a lot of that has not been happening around the country, but we believe that it could. And one reason it has not been happening around the country is that the departments themselves push back against change. Officers don't see themselves in this way. They see themselves in a different way. And so, as I mentioned before, what's really needed is a cultural shift. Now, peace officer is a time-tested concept in American policing, and we're hoping that we can help move departments around the country closer to this. We have done a couple dozen departments around the country with all different sorts of programs. And then beyond the symbolism of this, we're working with departments to make sure that they're aligning their practices and policies with officers' behaviors beyond just peace officers. You can see here we have outfitted uniforms. This is the state of South Carolina. the largest sheriff in Richland County, which is Columbia, about 1,000 sheriff's deputy uniforms are wearing peace officer on them. And then what we intend to do is to actualize this within every department, inspiring a code of conduct with culture and training and reward systems and other forms of very low dose tools that we're hoping departments will increasingly embrace now that they have an idea that they really are going to need to change. Prior to George Floyd and the riots and everything that had happened, I must say that our work was a little bit uphill, but that is really no longer the case. And so the inbound inquiries from departments who are interested in making a cultural shift, even if it's a nod to their community, is a step in the right direction. And so with that, I will let esteemed Chief Grady take it away. I just wanted to give you a little update on peace officers.
Thank you, Lisa. And Arnold, I'd like you to introduce our esteemed Chief Grady.
I think it would be Arthur. So go ahead, unmute yourself.
Oh, did
Arthur.
I say Arthur? Arthur, we would like
Yes.
you to introduce.
Okay. Well, I'm here with my my wife Molly, because both of us knew Chief Grady when he was Chief of Police of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and he had kind of an impossible task because it's of course a Hispanic town, and they've never had a black police chief, and many people were very bitter about that. They tried to sabotage him in various ways, and he had to create peace across these cultural boundaries, which was great training, because then he went from there to work for the United Nations. He was the senior police advisor to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and a senior police officer to the Palestinian Authority of Police, and regional commander for the United Nations International Police Task Force in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And what he did there, he had police officers who were actually literally at war with each other. They had family members killed by each other. And somehow he had to meld them into one force. And we really want to hear tonight about that remarkable experience in peacekeeping. He's also worked in the Democratic Republic of Congo with the Kenyan National Police and so on. And he's the author of The Injustice of Justice, The Absurdity of Compromise, which actually is something we heard about in one of our previous meetings, how we have to move beyond compromise to convergence, and a case study of resistance to change in the Santa Fe Police Department. So without further ado, here he is. We're pleased and honored to welcome Chief Grady.
Let me start out by telling you about this whole thing we call policing. Policing is kind of a really strange animal. When you have a democracy and you're looking at this whole thing we call policing, there's a natural dynamic tension between the two entities. You have to recognize that in order to do policing effectively, you have to have a credible threat of force. Otherwise, you don't get compliance. But there's a problem with that when you consider the whole idea of democracy, which is all about freedoms. It's not about being coerced. It's not about being forced. It's not about being manipulated. It's about freedoms. So there's that dynamic tension between policing and democracy. But we've got similar problems all across the world, because even in autocracies where you've got someone that's in absolute authority, you still have a tension with the police, because everyone wants to be able to control the police. In fact, we all think we know what policing is about. That's because we see police cars driving down the road. We've perhaps been stopped by a police car once or twice. So we think we understand policing. That's roughly the equivalent of saying, because I go to an ATM or cash a check every once in a while, I understand banking. Nothing could be further from the truth. Policing is a unique kind of a process that has to be dealt with on a global level. We live in silos. And it's an unfortunate circumstance, but that's where we are. If you just take a look at government, if we talk about social services, they've got their own silo. You talk about Parks and Rec, they have their own silo. If we talk about streets, they've got their own silo. Everybody lives in their own silo, and they want to do their business in their silo, unaffected by anybody else. Policing is exactly the same. Police believe that they are a standalone silo and that they make the rules as to how things should be done to the public. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on because I'm going to tell you that that's a really bad idea. The police should never have been designed to do things to the public. They should have been designed to do things with and for the public. Not only should they have been doing things with and for the public has to be integrally involved. The most important person in any police organization is the citizen. It's not the chief. It's not a captain. It's not a sergeant. It's not the patrol officer. It is the citizen. Now, the problem is the police believe that you've hired them to do a particular job. Now, the question is, what is that job? You know, if you ask any police officer today what he does for a living, he will tell you he's a law enforcement officer or something along those lines. Now, I heard you mention earlier that, you know, peace officers, and you talked about constables, and you talked about sheriffs, you talked about all of these different groups, and they all have different titles, but theoretically they have the same mission, theoretically. The problem is nobody seems to really know what that mission is. Once again, if you ask the police, they'll tell you it's law enforcement. Well, enforcing the law is part of what policing is about, but it's only one small part of policing. It is not the entirety of policing. The problem that we have is that since the police believe that their job is law enforcement, all of their measures have been developed around the idea of enforcement. And all of their methodologies and strategies for how to go about maintaining enforcement has been all developed around the idea that enforcement is the end all and be all. Consequently, we have police officers enforcing by any means necessary. And that is what they consider to be necessary, which is another misnomer when you get to policing. If you look at the courts right now, the courts will tell you that if we're going to judge a police officer, we need to judge him by what would another reasonable police officer do. Well, who comes up with what a reasonable police officer should do? The police. They decide what a reasonable police officer should do. That's why when you find that we see something that we see as egregious, that it was clearly outside the lines of what we would believe to be reasonable, the police always find a way to justify it. Now, right now we see that America, and indeed the world, is in an upheaval. And we're upset about the idea that people of color seem to lose their lives in inordinate amounts at the hands of the police. But have you ever wondered why the district attorney or a state's attorney can take the information around that arrest or around that death to a grand jury, and the grand jury will inevitably tell you they don't see anything wrong? It rather baffles me. You see, here in America, as a society, we're rather schizophrenic. See, we want the police to keep us safe. We want them to protect us, but we don't want them to step outside the bounds of what we consider to be reasonable and rational. But when they do step outside those bounds, and we take it to a grand jury, the grand jury finds a way to say, we didn't see anything wrong. Now, what would deter a police officer from doing something that's inappropriate if any time they do it, it's being applauded as appropriate? Nobody ever gets punished. No one is ever held accountable. No one is ever really criticized. In fact, if you look at the news reports, the only death at the hands of the police that's been criticized recently is George Floyd. And why? Because for almost 9 minutes, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we saw an officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, with his hand on his hip, rather nonchalantly telling him to just be quiet and don't worry about it. If sooner or later we'll let you up. 2 other officers were also on his back, and they didn't get up. It's not as if they got up and they walked around and they tried to pull the other officer off. You had 3 officers on the back of this guy for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. You had another officer blocking the public view as much as possible and keeping anyone else from interfering with what the officers were doing. Now, for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we all got very, very upset when we watched this snuff film on TV. We watched 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a man asking for breath and not getting it. Now, it's a simple thing here, because if you think about it, all it would have taken was for one officer to stand up, grab the other officer and pull him off and said, enough. But he didn't do that. Now they will argue that their training caused them to do that because he was the senior officer. So we're going to follow the instructions of the senior officer. Common sense doesn't play into that. Now, every one of you that I'm talking to right now, I'd be willing to bet that your common sense told you that at some point they need to get off of his neck. They need to let him breathe. Why is it the other officers didn't think the same thing? Because they're all doing groupthink. It's all about what the officers believe they should do in order to protect and serve. My question is, who are you protecting and who are you serving? You see, we got common sense. If we were to use a reasonable person perspective as opposed to a reasonable police officer perspective, we may have ended up with an entirely different outcome. Think about this one for just a second. The police arrived on the scene because supposedly there was a counterfeit $20 bill. This counterfeit $20 bill was passed to the store. Now let's say that George Floyd intentionally was passing a counterfeit $20 bill. What does my common sense tell me he would have done as soon as he left the store? This is the audience participation part. Where somebody says, he'd have left the area.
Split the scene. He would have got out of there.
He wouldn't have stayed there. He wouldn't have gotten in a car and sat right across from the store that he passed the counterfeit $20 bill in. It's time to leave. But he didn't leave. He's sitting in the vehicle. Why is he sitting in the vehicle? My guess is he didn't know it was a counterfeit $20 bill.
He was just having a drink.
I'd be willing to bet that most of you at some point or another in your life has passed a counterfeit $20 bill. They're all over the place. That's why they teach clerks in stores to hold them up so that they can see the watermarks. You don't see a watermark? It's counterfeit. Or they give them a pen so that they can mark the bill. If it doesn't show right, it's counterfeit. But even they have to either look for the watermark or they have to draw it on the pen. Now, most of us don't do that. So we don't know we've got a counterfeit bill. And they're being handed out all over the place. Now, let's just go back to George Floyd again. So he would have left if he had been intentionally passing a counterfeit $20 bill. He didn't leave. But when the police showed up, even if he hadn't thought to leave beforehand, when the police roll up on the scene and he just passed the counterfeit $20 bill and they walk into the store, what's he going to do? He's going to leave. So any reasonable, living, breathing, thinking creature would automatically surmise he didn't know it was a counterfeit $20 bill. So if I had talked to him, if I had gotten a little information from him, we might have not had that circumstance. Now, all of that sets the stage for what we're about to talk about. And that is, what is the mission of the police? What is it that we're supposed to be doing? You see, if we look at Sir Robert Peel will tell us that he didn't want it to be a military organization. He didn't want the police dressed up in police uniform or in military uniforms. He didn't want the police acting as if they were under military control. He wanted them to be very different, and he wanted to be very involved in the community. This is the original concept of community policing. But American policing was not built on the model of Sir Robert Peel. It was built on a model of suppression and control. First organized police department in the United States of America was in Charleston, South Carolina. And it was for regulating the behaviors of what they considered to be the dangerous classes. Africans, Native Americans, Hispanics. We need to control these groups. So for slaves, we had slave patrols. We made certain that the slave, if he tried to run away, he got caught and he got brought back. If he was doing anything that his master didn't want him to do, the slave patrols made certain that he was held accountable. Indians were slaves too. Now, they had Indians that were slaves that they took away from the country because it was much harder to control the Indians than it was to control African Americans. They had nowhere to go. But nevertheless, you still had Native Americans that were slaves. And you had lots of Hispanics that were indentured servants or worked as slaves as well. But we have to control that population. And the system was designed to maintain that control. Now, I will tell you that every system is perfectly designed to get the results it achieves. Now, if we accept that as an axiom, then we have to realize that everything that we see going on in policing today, whether it's here in the United States of America or overseas, is because the system is designed to get those results. We also have to accept the fact that anyone not included in the design of a system is necessarily excluded from the benefits of that system. Which means what? Who created the system of policing for the United States of America? Affluent European American males. They didn't have any women involved in that. They didn't have any gays or lesbians involved in that. No African Americans, no Hispanics, no Native Americans, only affluent European American males. We didn't even consider lower socioeconomic European American males, just the affluent American males. So is there any wonder that we would find that this system that's been designed for that group of people would abuse every other group of people? Now, I know that there's somebody in this group that I'm talking to right now that's thinking, well, wait a minute. Women weren't excluded from policing. Well, sure they were. And that's why we have some of the problems that we have when we look at the judicial system and how it treats women. Let's think about something simple. Let's think about the crime of rape. You ever wonder why it is so many rapists get off? How does that happen? Rape is a serious crime. It's absolutely appalling to me. I can't even begin to imagine how we would create a system that would allow a rapist to walk away. But you see, we put the blame on the woman. For example, if we think about date rape. Now, when I think about that, I said there's no more absurd term anywhere. Date rape, I can almost guarantee you that the date ended where the rape started. But why do we have it called date rape? Because we want to ascribe some of the culpability for the rape to the victim. So, victim goes out, she has dinner with the guy, they have a few drinks, they go back to the apartment, they engage in some petting, then he rapes her. It's a date rape. But he's otherwise a good guy. He wouldn't really rape anybody. And then they rape the woman over the coals, and he walks away. Well, let's do the same thing, but instead of her being raped, she's murdered. So they go out and they have dinner, they have a few drinks, and they go home and they engage in some petting, and she says something that really irritates him, and he pulls out a gun and kills her. What do we call that, a date homicide? Nobody would call it a date homicide because we're not going to ascribe any of the responsibility for the homicide to the victim. But who created the system? Who was it created for? And would it be any wonder that a system created by a class of people to protect themselves and to oppress others would do anything differently? Now, I found that
Don, can I jump
as
in?
I went overseas, we were dealing with authoritarian, autocratic police departments. There are no organizations more feared in autocracy than the police and the military. That's because they're used for purposes of oppression, for purposes of repression, to maintain control over certain classes of people. Now, they don't pull any bones about that. They make it very clear that that's what it's all about. And the people are afraid of them. They have absolute authority, absolute control. So I get a call one day. In fact, I'm sitting in the city of Santa Fe, and I get this call from the State Department that says, we want you to go to Bosnia-Herzegovina and help build a multi-ethnic police department. And I was like, wait a minute. I don't even know anybody at the State Department. And I don't have a clue where Bosnia-Herzegovina is. Not that I'm an idiot, but let's face it, I mean, Bosnia-Herzegovina wasn't taught to me in my history classes or in my geography classes. So I'm not sure where that even is. But they told me that somebody had called them and told them, look, if you've got an impossible task that somebody in policing needs to help you with, the one person we can think of is right there in Santa Fe. Well, any of you see the movie, The Devil's Advocate? At one point in The Devil's Advocate, the devil says, vanity is my favorite sin. And somebody on the other end of that phone had figured it out. So they had already told me, they said that if anybody could do it, it would be you. My vanity went right to work. And so I'm like, okay, well, if somebody said I could do it, maybe I can do it. And so I went and spoke to them. And they told me they were giving me an impossible task. Can't be done. So my question is, then why did you ask me to come here? He said, well, we got to give a legitimate face to this thing. We've got to make everybody believe that we're actually trying to create a multi-ethnic police in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I said, okay, then that's what I'll do. And they went, you don't understand. It can't be done. We already know it's impossible. There are three groups. There's the Serbs, there's the Bosniaks, and there's the Croats. And they hate each other. They've been killing each other in the most heinous ways imaginable. And now somebody wants them to form a unified police department. It's not going to happen. Accepted the challenge anyway. I got to Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I met with the commissioner and the deputy commissioner, and they told me the same thing they had told me at the State Department. It's impossible, can't be done. We've already talked to every regional commander in the theater, and they've all agreed it can't be done. It will never happen. So now I'm sitting down with the ambassador, the head of the mission, and he's got a table full of people sitting around. They're all right there to help him to do what needs to be done, and I'm one of those people. And he's telling everybody that here he is, our guy, he's the commander for Brcko, and he's going to help us with this whole idea of multi-ethnic policing in Brcko. The only problem is we all know it can't be done. And then me being as I am, I had to ask him, I said, excuse me, Ambassador, if it can't be done, why did you bring me here? And he said, well, we have to give everybody the idea, the impression that we're actually working on this and that we can make it happen. I said, okay, well, do you need a multi-ethnic police? Yes, we do. Okay, then that's what I'll give you. And he says, no, Commander, you don't understand. It can't be done. We've already talked to everybody in the area, everybody in the mission, and they all agree it cannot be done. I said, then why did you bring me here? He says, well, because we need to try. I said, well, if you need to try, then that's what I'll give you. I will give you a multi-ethnic police. He says, Commander, you're setting yourself up for failure. And I said, no, Ambassador.
So tell us how you did it, Don. Don?
I'm sorry?
Tell us how you did it. How did you bring them together?
Well, this is where I'm going.
Together?
So I had to tell him, I'm setting myself up for success. In order to be successful, I must first believe I can be successful. Now, he gave me a few reasons why it couldn't be done. We don't have any vehicles. My question is, what did you do before you had vehicles? Well, we don't have any computers. What did you do before you had computers? Well, the bottom line is, you can do whatever it is that needs to be done if you just think outside the box and don't let yourself be strapped by these things associated with technology. So now we get together and we have to sit down, and I've got this group of people that I have to work with. And I've got to figure out exactly how we go about structuring this thing so that we can decommission the Serb police, because the Serbs were in absolute control of Brcko. It was all the Serbs. I had to decommission the Serb police department and create one with Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs. So we had a commissioner or a chief of police that was selected that's going to be a Serb. We had two deputies, one a Bosniak and one a Croat. We created a list of all of the people that had been police officers prior to the war. Some of them were fairly qualified police officers. They just had some bad leadership. But we had to screen out the bad apples. I hate to use that term, but we had to screen out the bad cops and bring in good cops. And we had to figure out, how do we make them all work together, since they have been killing each other in the most heinous ways imaginable just months before. The big thing is to understand that everything that happens is going to happen as a result of communication. You see, every war ends in one of three ways: annihilation, occupation, or communication. They had already tried to annihilate one another. It didn't work out real well, but they had made a pretty good start. Then they occupied. The Serbs occupied Brcko. So they were in complete control. But that wasn't working out real well either, because they had riots going on all the time. Every single day they had homicides, rocket attacks. They had houses that were being blown up. This is on a daily basis. So occupation wasn't working out real well either. So having looked at that, my idea is you've got to start talking. Now, I created a model, and Arthur just mentioned to you a book that I wrote called The Absurdity of Compromise. The absurdity of compromise is all about understanding how to interact with other people so that the results are mutually satisfying. Now, see, we all have been taught all our lives that the whole idea of compromise is how we all win. It's a win-win. Everybody gets a little something out of this thing, but everybody actually also loses a lot of something. In Mostar, which is in Bosnia-Herzegovina, they had attempted to develop a multi-ethnic police. Now, they only had two groups to worry about: the Bosniaks and the Croats. The problem is, in their discussions, they let the Bosniaks and the Croats decide who was going to be a part of the police and on their side. Well, subsequently what happened was the Bosniaks picked the meanest, ugliest, most obstinate people on their side that they could. Why? Because they're still at war. They still think they need to win. And the Croats did the exact same thing. All they succeeded in doing was putting the United Nations in the middle of it. So there was no talking. They're still fighting. And when the United Nations wasn't there, they were killing each other. We had to decide that we weren't going to allow that to happen. You see, the first level of the communication model I talked to you about is conflict. That's where most people start out. And unfortunately, a lot of times that's exactly where we end up. Conflict. It's a fight to the death. Somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. That's where we start. Now, if we get a little bit better and decide that we're going to try to appease people, we will go to compromise. And we've already been told that compromise is a win-win. So we're going to try to win by compromising. So now we come up with something that we think is going to be acceptable. I'll give you something, you give me something, we both lose a little something, but in the end, we've compromised and it works. It doesn't work. Everybody walks away dissatisfied. So what I've done is told you that there's a third level. We don't need to be satisfied with level 1 and level 2. There's a third level. Empathetic understanding. And it really is about taking the time to engage in active, intelligent listening so that I can figure out exactly what it is that we're talking about and exactly what it is that you think you need so that we can meet your needs or exceed your expectations so that when you walk away, you feel good about it. At the same time, I can feel good about it because I'm not going to compromise. What we're going to do is I'm going to help you get what you need, and you're going to help me get what I need, but we're not going to force each other to compromise in order to do it. We will find a way to meet the needs and expectations of the other without forcing them to compromise. That's what we did in Brcko. We sat them down and said, all right, what is our mission? What are we supposed to do? And the idea is we've got to build a multi-ethnic police department to serve all of Brcko and all of the inhabitants of Brcko equally. And we need to make certain that in order to do that, we've got to find the right people. We've got to develop the right training scenario. We've got to do the right things psychologically. We've got to make certain that we've got the right equipment and the right tools. And above everything, we've got to have the right measurements. When we do law enforcement, what are we measuring? How many arrests we make? That's enforcement. So we're going to just make as many arrests as we can, and that's going to show how successful we've been. And I said that doesn't show you anything except that you've made an arrest. If your mission is to make arrests, then I suppose you're being successful. But if your mission is public safety and security, did you actually meet that mission by making arrests? The answer to that question is probably no. We've been measuring policing in the wrong way. So we decided that the measure for success in this police department would not be how many arrests were made, but the absence of crime. You see, if I was a doctor and you were going to tell me how good I was, you'd do that based on the fact that you had an absence of illnesses, that I wasn't letting you get sick, that I was taking care of you and making certain that you were a healthy human being. Well, if I'm going to be a cop and I'm going to make certain that I'm taking care of your safety and security, then I need to make certain that I'm not measuring my success by how many times you get beat across the head and have your purse stolen or have your wallet stolen, but instead by how safe I keep you, how secure you are. The fact that you never have to worry about someone stealing your purse or your wallet. So we changed the measures. Our measure of success is the absence of crime. When we have no crime, we know we've been successful. If we have crime, we're not. Which means we have to hire people that are willing to accept that idea of success. So when we get the action and adventure cops, those that really believe that they just need to go out and knock heads and cuff them, stuff them, and put them in jail, that's not the police officer that we need. We need the guy that's cerebral and the sympathetic. The one that's thinking about how to build community. How do I make my community stronger? How do I make it last longer? How do I make it better? So when we set out for this thing, we said, how are we going to do that? Well, we already know what happens if I let Serbs pick Serbs and Bosniaks pick Bosniaks and Croats pick Croats. We know what's going to happen. They'll be just like they were in Mostar. They'll be fighting with each other. They'll be killing each other. And the United Nations will be walking around trying to figure out what the heck is going on. So we had to decide we're not going to do that. Well, we had to go through a few iterations, but once again, remember now, the whole idea is empathetic understanding. What do you need? So I asked the Serbs, what do you need? Now, part of this process is everybody has a story, and you have to let them tell their story. See, if you don't let them tell their story, then you're starting from a position of nothingness. I don't have a clue what it is you think you want or need, or why you think you want it or need it. So we let everybody tell their story. Tell me your story. And I listen. I don't talk, I listen. Now, I let you tell your story one time. Because if I let you, you'll keep telling that story over and over and over again, and every time something new comes up, you'll give me a new twist to the story. Nope, you get to tell me the story one time. Tell me everything that's important, everything I need to know. If you don't tell me that first time, what's important, it wasn't important. You tell me all the important stuff, I get it. So we let them all tell their story. When we finished with the stories, it was an amazing thing because the stories were all very similar. They had all gone through similar things. So now we have to say, what is it that you need? Each group. And they tell us what they need. It's an amazing thing again. They all needed the same thing. You know, it's kind of like if you fall back on the Maslow hierarchy of needs, safety and security, that's the second level. Everybody really wanted safety and security. And it was going to be their job to provide it to everybody in the community. So if we understand that and we accept that, then the question is, how are we going to provide it? And who is it that we're going to need to help us to provide it? Well, they each had their own ideas, so they started talking about, okay, give me just 2 more minutes. If we go through this thing and we talk about how we're going to get there, it starts with who you bring into the organization. If you hire the wrong people, you'll get the wrong result. You've got to hire the right people. It starts with personnel. It pretty much ends with personnel. So we developed a mechanism that allowed each of the groups to select members from each of the other groups to be in the department. And they all decided that, look, we can't hire the meanest, baddest, ugliest guy from the other group to be in this police department. We need to hire someone that's going to work with everybody else, which was the antithesis of what happened in Mostar. By the time we finished, we had developed a police department with people who were empathetic, who were understanding, who were very, very cerebral, and people who really wanted to build community. The end result was Brcko had a police department that was no longer feared. They were no longer hated. In fact, several years later, when they asked which organization that the international community had come in to build did they most feel comfortable with, or had most confidence in, it was the police.
Yeah. Hey, Don.
Bravo.
Yes,
Good job, Don. Could you comment for us on how can we change policing to public safety in the United States? How do we do that? Can we do that as citizens or have to go from within departments?
Actually, you have to do it as a collective, police and citizen. You've got to divorce yourself of the idea of the silos that I talked about earlier. You don't live in a silo. You live in a community. And everybody inside that community touches everybody else in that community. It has to be an interactive activity. Now, the problem that we have right now is the police think that they have all the answers to all of your problems. You don't think that they have the answers to your problems. But since they're the police department, nobody questions them, and they let them do what it is that they want to do. In order to make this thing work, you have to now get to the point where you recognize that the police are part of the community, and the community are the police. And now we have to develop a system that's entirely dependent on every other group, that they're all interactive and they all share the same outcome.
We have still over 50 people online here, and I know Don will be glad to hang on for a little bit. I know it's getting past the 7:30 hour here, but if you have a question, could you please, because I can't see everybody at the same time here, put your question in the chat box for me, or that you have a question, I will call on you.
Thank you. Well, Don, I just want to thank you. You notice nobody left. Your story was so riveting and so positive, so possible. So I have to go do a little talk, but I want to just thank you. As president of our club, you were fantastic. You showed us what compassion, empathy, and real communication can accomplish. Donald, Dr. Grady, I want to thank you. We need more men.
Don works just fine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sala, you have your hand up. Could you unmute yourself and speak, please?
Yes, I'm living in Seattle, and the police are part of a war here right now. And I wanted to know how you work to bring the community into the decisions that are being made, so they're not just made in the silos that you talked about.
Okay. When I was in Brcko, I had a captive audience. You see, everybody had already figured out that policing needed to change, couldn't remain the same in function. And that's one of the problems with change. Everybody that's going to be affected by the change has to agree to making the change. If you've got one side that doesn't want to change, then you are running headlong into problems and trying to make a change. And your problem right now in Seattle is the police think that they have all the ideas. They know what they're supposed to do. And they think they're good. They think they're really, really good. The fact that you're dissatisfied with them just irritates them. What do you know about policing? You don't know anything about what I do. I put my life on the line for you every single day, and you don't appreciate it. So now we've set ourselves up for conflict. But what we have to do is understand that the police are a monopoly. And because they are a monopoly, they only work to support themselves. Ask yourself this question. If the crime rate goes up and we find that there are more problems in the community, what does the police chief do? He asks for more money and more people. And what does the society do? They gives him more money and more people. So he can do exactly what he's been doing before, but he can do it even better now because he's got more money and more people. And the idea is that he's going to control this society. He's going to make certain that those of you who were not involved in creating this system don't benefit from that system. And what we have to do is make them realize that they can't be a monopoly. So in order to make policing change, you got to have an alternative. And right now, there are no alternatives. Monopolies exist to take care of themselves, not to take care of you. You see, if you get mad at the police department and decide that you don't like them anymore, what can you do? Fire them all? You see, if you had a plumber that didn't do his job and you still had a leak when he left, you fire him and you bring in a new plumber. With the police, crime rate's going up and he's supposed to be bringing it down. We've got more trouble in the streets, we just give them more money and more people. We've got to turn that around. It can't be a monopoly. You must create an alternative. Now, you've got people talking about defunding the police. You can't really defund the police. You see, 95% of the budget for any police department, or approximately 95%, goes to personnel. So if you cut out the personnel, what do you have left? Now, you got someone that says, oh, yeah, but we'll take the money and we'll give it to social workers. And I say, okay, now think about what you just said. See, because the problem here is when a police officer gets a call for service, he doesn't necessarily know what he's going into. So if we decide that, oh, well, it sounds like a social worker call, we're going to send a social worker. I said, okay. So you get a call that you've got somebody that's acting rather strange and he's being unruly and nobody can talk to him. That sounds like a social worker job. We send a social worker. And a social worker would be just fine until they walk in the door and they find out that there's a man in there walking around with no clothes on, wielding a machete and speaking in tongues. What do you do with that as a social worker? We got a problem. Police are first responders. Now, they should be able to go in and find a way to subdue this man, put some clothes on him, take the machete away from him. It's okay if he talks in tongues. We don't need to understand him right now. But then get the social worker in. The police should be first responders. They should be facilitators. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that we are not a closed system. It's an open system. And it all interacts with everybody that's in it. The police have to have a component of the department that deals with social work issues. So when we get a call like that, they de-escalate, get social workers in. Now there's a key component here that's critical to making this work. Right now we have a system that allows for warrantless arrest. Police officers have probable cause, they can make an arrest. But if you watch, you find that most of these warrantless arrests start out with absolutely nothing or something very minor. But the moment the police officer goes hands-on, we've got a problem. Then you end up with somebody like Eric Gardner, who's just standing on the street corner because that particular day, he wasn't even selling single cigarettes. He was just on the corner. But they decided to tell him that he had to do something. And he says, look, I'm not doing anything. I'm just on the corner. Leave me alone. Well, that's the wrong thing to tell a cop because the action and adventure type will automatically go hands-on. And when they do, every single person that I know, regardless of how benign they are, will pull away. Now we've got a resisting arrest. And so since they pulled away and now we got a resisting arrest, next thing you end up with is a disorderly conduct. And now we got a battery to a police officer because he pulled away and the police officer broke his fingernail. So now we got resisting arrest, battery to a police officer, and disorderly conduct. Warrantless arrest. But what would happen if we said, you get on the scene, you analyze what's going on, you make your report, you give that report to the magistrate, and the magistrate decides whether or not a warrant should be issued. If a warrant should be issued, now we have a warrant. We don't end up with hands-on. We don't end up with the fight. You've got a warrant. You go in and explain it to the guy, and we're likely to end up with a much different outcome. It's the emotions of the moment that push otherwise benign circumstances into disorderly conduct, battery to a police officer, and resisting arrest. And you will see it over and over and over and over again.
I think
You saw it with Eric
Don,
Gardner.
I think we have
You saw it with George Floyd.
yes, we have about 2 more questions here, and I'm sure that some people have questions. I'll email those to you if we can get some answers back to folks, if that's okay.
Sure, that'll be fine.
And Sharon, do you still have a question? You have to unmute yourself.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm awesome. I have to say that I just listening to you, I was like, oh my gosh, he is so telling the truth. I'm a retired police officer for HPD. And it's like everything that you said is so amazingly on point. And I think that your suggestions that, you know, in order to change things is on point. It's just, I don't know how well received that's going to be within a police department if they're so firm in the way that they've been doing things. I know maybe now, seeing how all this madness is, you know, is going down, maybe they'll be forced to do some change. But I know when I was an active duty police officer way back, when things were going, like when they were having to fire some people that worked in the jail and put police officers in the jail, when they were paring down, the first thing that went was community service. You know, it's like, I don't know, it just doesn't seem, and I know when I was there, it just didn't seem.
What is her question?
Sharon, you've lost your audio. If you have a question and you have audio, please ask your question. Okay. Sharon lost her audio.
I love listening to you. Oh my gosh, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon. Warren Banks, do you have your hand up still? If not, I'll jump over to Derek. Derek, do you have a question, please?
Yes, I'd like to compliment Don. When Sala went to ask him a question, she referred to him as doctor. And titleitis can be a terrible condition for people. So when you said, just call me Don, so there's a compliment to you as a leader. The other question I have is the police corruption is due to the blue code of silence. How do you, as this rational human being and a leader, address some of those problems that you have to face?
The answer is really very simple. It's just hard to do. Because as I told you, policing is a monopoly. And because it's a monopoly, they don't have to satisfy you, the customer. They only have to satisfy themselves. You have no alternative. And because you have no alternative, they just thumb their nose at you and continue to do what they were doing, and you walk away dissatisfied, and that's the end of the story. But what
Which is
happens if there's an
unfortunate.
alternative?
The other thing is semantics. And when the term cop, to me, is the bottom of the barrel. Now we're talking a peace officer, not a police officer, but a peace officer. So sometimes semantics work.
Well, semantics do work. But you know what the acronym COP stands for?
Constable on patrol or something?
Constable on patrol.
Right.
That's not a bad thing.
Well, in Britain, it's
Actually-
common, yeah, but here it's
actually,
a
that's a good
derogatory
thing.
term.
The problem is we've turned it upside down, because what we've done is allowed that constable on patrol to make life and death decisions without having to seek a warrant. We've allowed them to make life or death decisions based on their emotions of the moment. So you'll find somebody like Rodney King that gets beat unmercifully. And why? Because he had the audacity to run from the cops. And that just irritated them. And so he got what they call popo, pissed off a police officer. And then they just beat him unmercifully. And then you found a jury that said, we watched it on video and we didn't see anything wrong. He should have complied. What I'm suggesting to you is there has to be an alternative. And who creates the alternative? It's what we did in Bosnia. You see, we dismantled the Serbian police. They controlled it. Now, we didn't take every Serbian police officer that was in that department and say, you can never be a cop again. We just have to review you. We have to vet you and make certain that you're appropriate to be in this department. And then we bring in other people that equally are vetted to make certain that they're going to be right for what we're asking you to do. The end result was, it takes a little time, but when we finished, we had the right people in the jobs. You see, sometimes the biggest, strongest, toughest guy on the block isn't the right one to be a cop. Sometimes it's a small, frail woman with a lot of intellect and a lot of willingness to go the extra mile to understand. And it's an amazing thing. Do you know that a police officer with a college education is 40% less likely to engage in an act of force than his high school educated counterpart? 40%, just by having a degree. We could cut down on excessive or unnecessary uses of force just by making certain that everybody had a degree. Do you also know that if it's a woman, she's much, much less likely to engage in an act of excessive or unnecessary use of force than a guy? You know why? She understands that brute force isn't going to get her through the day. 9 times out of 10, she's got to use her head. So she goes to level 3, empathetic understanding. She starts communicating with the idea that everybody's going to walk out of this thing a winner. She's not fighting. She's not on level 1. She's on level 3. That's where we have to go. We have to understand that, yep, maybe we need to dismantle this police department. Give me an alternative. Find me a police department that can come in, make my community safe until I can build a new police department that will function in exactly the way I need it to function. That's not a hard thing to do. It's time consuming, and it takes more intestinal fortitude than most of us were born with.
All right. Got Jackie Newberry.
Yes, I'm from Houston. I wanted to ask, the current drug policies for the entire country seem to be a major reason of police interaction with people, particularly nonviolent users of drugs, most often cannabis. And, you know, it seems like it's used to license them to become aggressive and violent, using no-knock warrants, and instead of concentrating on the gangs and the cartels are really the ones who are the problem.
Okay. So, Don, you want to comment on the current drug policy and how that affects calls?
Sure. Part of our problem is that we've used drugs as a way to control the dangerous classes. You see, European Americans use drugs at roughly the same level as other people of color, Hispanics, Native Americans, African Americans, Asians. We're all using drugs at about the same level, but we don't get arrested at the same levels. We don't get stopped at the same levels. But you see, if the objective is to control the dangerous classes, then we use any mechanism allowable to do that. And unfortunately, as I said, America is schizophrenic in this regard. You see, the Supreme Court ruled that if I can find a motor vehicle violation on your vehicle, it doesn't make any difference why I want to stop your car. If I can find a violation anywhere, I can stop you and it's legal. It's called pretextual stops. So what happens is, I see a car driving down the street and it's got a Hispanic male in it. I don't like the way he looks, so I want to stop the car. So I find that little sticker that we have on most plates in most states, and it's not exactly where it should be. It's covered up a little bit by a frame. So what I do is I can now stop you. And when I stop you, that stop is legal. even though that's not why I really stopped you. So now I go up and I start asking you questions. I get you to get out of the car. I search your car and I find contraband. Now you're under arrest and we start to struggle. So I got a disorderly conduct, a resisting arrest, and a battery to a police officer that all started out because of an improper display. Now, I will tell you that that's an end run around the Constitution. You see, in this country, discrimination is illegal. So if you discriminate against somebody because you don't like the way they look, you don't like something about them, it's called discrimination. But with a pretext, I can stop you anyway. So I don't like the way you look. I don't have a legitimate reason for stopping you, but if I can find a pretext, I can, and it's legal. We got to do away with the idea that pretext can be legal, and we can stop all of that stuff that's going on. Not only that, but we need to realize that at some point, we need to do an assessment as to what are the real damages being done to this society as a result of the use or abuse of drugs and how that's affecting the country. We're spending roughly $40,000 a year to keep a person in prison. So he uses marijuana. He gets busted for a dime bag, goes to prison. I'm going to spend $40,000 a year to keep a man in prison because I found him with a dime bag of marijuana? Prisons should be to keep the violent offender away from those that he would otherwise harm, not to take a man with a dime bag and put him in prison because I don't like the way he looks.
Okay, Don, we're going to have to wrap up here. We're way over. You've done a tremendous job. Thanks for joining us, and you've done your work internationally and here within our country is great. Your words of wisdom to us have been important, and I'm sure we'll have some other questions to reach out to you for. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and be safe out there.
Yes.
Well, thank you. And I hope you all stay well and all stay safe.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you so much, Don.
Great to see you.
Thank you. You
Good
take
night,
care. Have
everybody.
a wonderful evening.
You too.